Well, I've certainly enjoyed the debate tonight, and I hope you have as well. I think it's very evident in tonight's debate that there's no good reason to think that nature is all there is. Dr. Shook says, well, you can't prove that Santa Claus doesn't exist, and therefore you should not believe in Santa Claus simply because you lack evidence for Santa Claus. This is an analogy, I think, that supports my point of view. As Scott Shalkowski points out in his book, Atheological Apologetics, the reason adults disbelieve in Santa Claus is not simply that there is no good reason to think that he exists, but because we have good reasons to think that he does not exist. We have positive evidence against Santa Claus. There isn't anybody at the North Pole. There's nobody flying around delivering presents on Christmas Eve. So it's not enough just to show that absence of evidence, there's an absence of evidence for God. As criminologists will tell you, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I think that's enough to refute naturalism tonight. Now, what about the arguments for God? With respect to the origin of the universe, he agrees, I think, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. As for the universe beginning to exist, my philosophical argument has yet to be refuted. And as for the evidence for the Big Bang, we've seen testimony from Stephen Hawking, from Vilenkin, Bohr, and Guth, that their theorem requires that any universe in a state of cosmic expansion must have an absolute beginning. From that, it follows deductively, by the canons of logic, that therefore there is a transcendent cause of the universe, and that falsifies naturalism, because there is something beyond the world. Secondly, what about the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life? He could not show that the fine-tuning is physically necessary. He could not defend the alternative of chance. He didn't respond to my arguments against the multiverse. All he said was, well, maybe the present type of life couldn't flourish if the fine-tuning was there, but different forms of life might have flourished. This shows just a lack of familiarity with the fine-tuning in the literature. If these constants and quantities, like the weak force, were not finely tuned, the entire universe would consist of just helium or of just hydrogen. If the gravitational force were altered a bit, the entire universe would collapse to a singularity, or it would expand so fast that stars and galaxies and planets could never form where life might evolve. Indeed, unless these constants and quantities are exquisitely fine-tuned, not even chemistry, not even matter would exist. So the fact is that apart from this fine-tuning, no kind of self-replicating complex organisms could exist. And this cries out for an explanation. It is only the naturalist's bias against something beyond nature that would prevent him from inferring an intelligent designer of the cosmos. 3, what about objective moral values? Here again, I think the discussion has become confused. As we saw in the question time, I'm not saying we need God or revelation in order to discern objective moral values. I'm saying we need God in order to ground objective moral values. In the absence of God, we are simply lost in socio-cultural relativism. Moral values are simply spin-offs of the evolutionary process, akin to the altruistic behavior that you see exhibited in a troop of baboons or even in an anthill. These are programmed into us by evolution, and they are not objective. The psychopath, the Nazi war criminal, does nothing wrong when, according to his value system, he follows those recommendations that, like agriculture, will help him to arrive at his goals. If you disagree with that, if you agree with me that there are objective right and wrong, that there are real moral differences, that moral progress is possible, then you'll agree that God must exist. As for the resurrection of Jesus, I can assure you that if you look at the literature, we are not talking here about biased sources. We are talking about the majority of historians who have investigated Jesus of Nazareth, and the historical credibility of the Gospels has emerged very strongly, particularly with respect to those 3 facts: the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' faith. The origin of Christianity in the mid-1st century cries out for explanation. Why did this movement arise? Where did it come from? I can think of no better explanation than the one the original disciples gave and were willing to die for, namely that God raised Jesus from the dead. And finally, as for immediate experience, again, I am justified in believing in the objects of my immediate experience. Experience is one of the tests for truth for the naturalist. unless I have a good reason to think that I'm delusional. And there just hasn't been given any reason. We've not seen any arguments for naturalism. Quite the contrary, I think we've seen good empirical evidence that there is a reality. Beyond the universe, there is a supernatural realm, and I believe that that reality is God and that He has revealed Himself in Jesus Christ.